So here we start with Islam's literary impact on Africa. Other than Egypt and Nubia, most of Africa had no written records before the arrival of Islam, as pointed out. So literacy on a more major scale does come into Africa through Islam. Ethiopia is going to have a written script and take on its own script, a language called Ge'ez. Like I said, Egypt and Nubia will have script, but the major advent of more mass literacy again is going to come through the arrival of Islam. Now that's a positive impact. Islam, just like Christianity and Judaism, does have a history of slavery, and you can see them within the texts of the Old Testament, even the New Testament, and in the Quran. And yet, in a wild way, just to kind of point out, just as there was Christians in the Deep South defending the institution of slavery in America using the Bible, you had abolitionists, people against slavery who were Christians, actually using the Bible to say slavery was wrong. Occasionally, you'll see in the history of Islam, there are certain Muslims who saw Islam as a way to liberate people from slavery, while others see it as being integral, a part of Islam. And so I just kind of want to point that out. And the same thing goes for Judaism. And, if anybody wants the scriptures of any of these texts dealing with that, I can show you. But so anyhow, we've understood that Africa did have slavery amongst themselves in very different ways, and Islam also. So there was mainly for domestic servants. African slaves often were highly prized, symbols of wealth. And here's what's important: not necessarily perpetual or hereditary. And this is a more common way that slavery would exist in the ancient world in probably like many different societies. Racism did exist, and I'll show you some quotes that are very unfortunate, but slavery was not based on skin color in the way that it would be in the United States. And actually, I just kind of want to point this out, that slavery in the United States has a very kind of almost uniqueness to it. And even Thomas Jefferson and other thinkers during the time were aware of the difference and uniqueness of American slavery and in the color issue. Okay, that again was not as prevalent as explicit in the ways in other parts of the world. But at the same time, it did exist, so I want to make that clear too. A large number of Southern Europeans and Slavs were slaves and prized in the Islamic world. There's not 100% consensus on this, but it's believed by many that the word slave in the English language actually is derived from the word Slav. So that also kind of really changes things. Growing up in the United States, the word slave and black and African is synonymous in many people's minds, unfortunately. But here we actually have the idea of Slavs being associated with slavery. And so that's all I have to mention there at this point on Islam and slavery. We're going to then look at some negative views about blacks from Jews and Arab Muslims. And I will let you read these also. You can pause. Ibn Khaldun is a renowned, famous Arab philosopher, sociologist, historian. I can't encourage you enough to read his work if you can get a hold of translations of his texts. This, though, of course, is a very unfortunate quote, where he really associates blacks with slavery and talks about them having a lower degree of humanity. By the way, he also spoke very poorly of Arabs when he was referring mainly to Bedouin. And that's where I kind of get my theory that the issue is about literacy and civilization in this case, because his judgment of the desert Arabs as opposed to the literate, civilized, quote unquote, Arabs is almost as if he's talking about a different ethnicity compared to himself. But nonetheless, this is in writing, and then you have Moses Maimonides, also a very interesting 12th, 13th century Jewish thinker who's very important in the history of Judaism. And this quote comes from his famous book, Guide to the Perplexed, which is also a very important work in Judaism, and still actually, he's still a valued thinker in Judaism. But one of his unfortunate quotes as well, where he, and by the way, he did live in Egypt. He was the personal doctor to the Sultan after he fled Spain, but he basically says the level of black Africans is below that of a man and above that of a monkey, which kind of has a similar ring to what I've read in Thomas Jefferson's primary text. So again, why is this the case? What to do with this? It's unfortunate, but it also makes sense of kind of looking at, or it helps clarify certain attitudes that would be significant to history of the slave trade in Africa, and the way that Europeans and other outside forces would look down on it. And so next we're going to then slide into Africa and slave trade and the Portuguese. That'll be starting with the next lecture.